1 Timothy chapter number 2. 1 Timothy chapter number 2. Lord willing, we'll read 4 verses, but we're going to start with 2, and then we're going to skip some. Then we're going to read, I lied, 3 more verses. But if you'll remember, last time we taught Sunday school, we talked on Thanksgiving's essential role. Okay, but not just, we should be thankful, but we should make known our thanks outwardly. Okay, that's all that lesson and this one have to do with each other, is that outward portion of not just thanksgiving, but also praise, worship, prayer. Okay, keep that in mind as we get into it. But verse number 1, the Apostle Paul writes to Timothy in chapter number 2, I exhort therefore that first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. Okay, so the Apostle Paul, in verse number 1, we've taught on it before. I've heard it, I believe, preached one other time out of this passage on the 4 different types of what today we sum up with one word, prayer. Okay, we see in verse number 1 that first off, supplications, prayers, intercession, and giving of thanks. Supplication, to give a short recap to anybody that hadn't heard me or heard it preached on, supplication is going before God and petitioning God for a need. Okay, for a desire that may not be a need, but that you sincerely wish for it to be so. Okay, well, on Wednesday night when somebody says, pray for my lost, pray for my wayward. Okay, those are supplications. I don't need that to physically survive. I don't need that to spiritually survive. But I would like to see God move on this behalf. Okay? It's not selfish, but it is something that you're praying for. Either for the burden that God has given you and placed upon your heart, or a burden that you have developed that you would like to see God do something either for you, or you desire so sincerely for God to do something that you don't ask God for the things that you need. The Bible says that He'll take care of us, that He will supply our needs. Lord, I know that your word says you'll take care, and I thank you for that promise, but Lord, I have need of nothing today. I would rather pray for this. Okay, that's a supplication. Then, next, prayers. Okay, if you actually define the word in the Bible, prayer, it means worship. Okay, to truly worship God. Now, in order to worship God, you have to know Him, which is why the other form in the Bible of the other definition of the word prayer is communication with God. You have to have a personal relationship with God before you can worship Him. Even after you get saved, you have to know a little bit about Him. I mean, we sing more about Jesus. Would I know? More of His grace to others show. You got to know Him in order to worship Him in spirit and in truth. It's that truth part. You may have the Holy Spirit dwelling within you. Your spirit may try to worship God, but if you don't know anything about Him, if you haven't communed with Him, if you haven't had a relationship with Him, you can't worship Him because you can't do it in truth. Because you don't know the truth of how to worship God. Okay, then it says intercessions. That's praying for others. Okay, sometimes somebody may, literally come to you and say, hey, pray for this, if you don't mind. Okay, this is going on, and, I'm just getting people to pray for it. They may ask you to pray for them. Other times, God may lay it on your heart that you need to lift somebody else up before the throne of God. Now, nowhere in intercessory prayer is it defined that you have to know the need or you have to know the situation in order to intercede on somebody else's behalf at the throne of God. Okay, intercession is not getting involved in the business. Intercession is, God, you know what it is. I just pray that you do it according to your will. Intercession is, Lord, I don't know why you've laid this person on my heart, but Lord, I truly do sincerely desire for you to move on their behalf. I don't know what the situation is. Maybe I haven't even talked to this person. Maybe it's something that's recently happened and I don't even, I haven't gotten the phone call or the text message yet, but you told me to pray for this person, so I'm going to sincerely and earnestly pray for them. I don't need to know what the need is, Lord. I know that they're one of yours. I know that you love them. And I know that maybe right now they physically can't get away and pray. Okay, maybe somebody gets a phone call and they're off to the hospital. They may physically, they're in that state of mind where it's in shock. They can't take the time to pray. They're worried about getting to the hospital. But if God lays that person on your heart, you could pray for them. Even though in their flesh, they may be in a state of shock. Maybe in their flesh, they're in that space of grace to where, God's given them a space to, go and do something, but, they're not going to, commit a sin against God. They're just trying to get wherever it is. Okay, that kind of space of grace. And he's saying, pray for them now, because right now, they're worried about getting somewhere. Okay, right now, they're concerned about, whatever it is that's popped up, but you could pray for them right now. How many times in the epistles did the Apostle Paul write, we thank you for your prayers? Okay, he's already been on his missionary trips by the time he's writing the letters. So now he's in captivity. He can't get back to them. But all the time he says, multiple times you can find that we make mention of you always in our prayers, giving thanks unto God. Not just for, their support, but for the way that they've continued in the faith. These people knew about Paul's condition, and they lifted him up in prayer. Because they said, Lord, that's the man of God. We pray that you would use the man of God for your honor and your glory, and that your will be done in his life. That's intercessory prayer. And then finally it says, and giving of thanks be made before all men. We taught on that last time. Okay? Or be made for all men. Every man everywhere was the desire of the Apostle Paul, that every man, woman, boy, girl, on the face of the earth would take part in these 4 forms of communication with God. Well, in order to do that, everybody on the face of the earth would have to be saved. I do dare say that that's the desire of God. And if you don't believe me, read about 3 verses after this. Okay, that's the desire of God. But then look at verse number 2. He says, oh, and by the way, it's also my desire, and it's God's desire, for men everywhere to pray for kings. Okay, a lot of time we don't like the ones in authority, but notice why he says to pray for kings and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. We know that the scriptures tell us no man comes into power, no man falls out of power without the blessing of God. All power is his, and he gives power temporarily to certain individuals to accomplish his will on the face of the earth. Okay, it doesn't surprise God whoever got elected. It will never surprise God who got elected, because God already, 1, foreknew it, and 2, he had the authority that he gave them. It was commissioned by him. Okay, but we know we're supposed to pray for that. But why are we supposed to pray for him? Not because God put him into office, but that God put him into office for a purpose, and we're petitioning God saying, Lord, be with these people so that we can live a life in peace and have the freedom to do it in all godliness. Now, thankfully, we have that today. But how many people had to pray from when the Apostle Paul wrote this to Timothy, from the time that Timothy read this epistle to the time that the Constitution of the United States was ratified in 1781? Or no, 83 maybe? I don't know, I'm getting old. It's been a while since I've taken a U.S. history class. But when the Constitution was ratified by 12, not 13, Rhode Island, I'm still not happy with them because they abstained from the vote, which technically means somebody could make the argument that we illegally did away with the Articles of Confederation. They're idiots, but it all wouldn't have been an issue if Rhode Island would have just said yes. But we got away with them, came in with the Constitution, and as a result of the Constitution, what was passed exactly after that? The Bill of Rights. What's in the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States? Well, we get free speech, we get the freedom of the press, we get freedom of assembly. But what's the other one? Freedom of religion. Okay, if you haven't taken a walk down that hallway right there and looked at those prints that our pastor got from Brother Jeff Faggart in the Baptist Historical Preservation Society, there are several different prints that have a little picture frame next to them with a description of what's going on in those scenes. And those scenes happened right before, in some instances, the ratification of the Constitution. We had already won freedom from Great Britain in the Revolutionary War, but the Articles of Confederation weren't working out too well. And a man by the name of Leland talked to a man by the name of Madison, which would be James Madison. They called him the short bookworm of the Founding Fathers because he was short, and he usually carried around a stack of books as tall as he was. Okay, he was the one that was reading he knew a lot about law and about, societies all around. He was the father, if you would, of the Bill of Rights. And Leland, who was a preacher that believed as we believe, okay, he petitioned Madison and said, we'll put our support behind this, talking about him and the church. He said, we could care less about the political stuff. He says, what we want, and we will support you if you make it a constitutional right for every man, woman, and child to have a freedom of religion. Because some of those other prints, you find it even in America. After the Mayflower landed, okay, people think that that's where religious freedom started. Oh no. Okay, some situations, which is why I can't really be all that angry with Rhode Island, because they were okay with Baptist. But not every colony was okay with Baptist. Anybody ever heard of Pennsylvania? A lot of Quakers. Because the man who founded it, Penn, believed the way that the Quakers believed. So he made that a haven for Quakers. Okay, different states had different, religious, or colonies had different religious beliefs. And Great Britain didn't care as long as we kept paying tax money. They're like, do whatever you want to. Okay, if we gave you a charter to start a colony, you run the colony how you want to, because it was just a colony. It wasn't really a part of the empire. Okay, so even in America, we haven't always had religious freedom. But as I was reading this, I believe it was on Wednesday night that our pastor asked, anybody ever wonder about stuff? This is one of them things that I wonder about. Okay, how many prayers had to be asked before the will of God was fulfilled in true religious freedom? Because even in Great Britain, okay, there was a man, his name was King Henry. I don't know why we're getting into a history lesson, but the Lord put this on my mind, so we're going to say it. There's a man by the name of Henry. He didn't get along with the Pope, which I can understand. Okay, I don't fault him there, because there are a lot of things that I don't agree with the Pope. Okay, but the thing that he didn't agree with the Pope was the fact that he couldn't divorce whoever he wanted to. Okay, because he got married a whole bunch of times because they were idiots back then, and they thought that women determined the gender of a child, during the childbearing process. Nowadays, we know that that's up to the guy. Okay, go take a science class. Women can only give one type of chromosome, that's X. A man can give an X or a Y. If they give an X, it's a girl. If they give a Y, it's a boy. Okay, and it doesn't change after the moment of conception. But that's a whole different lesson, Brother Randy. We're not going to get on that today. Okay. But all of his wives kept having girls, and he was angry with them because he thought it was their fault, not his fault, and he wanted to keep divorcing them, and the Pope kept saying no. So he said, fine, I'll start my own church. That's where the Anglican Church comes in. They said the king will be the head of the church instead of the Pope, and the king can decide whatever we're going to do. Okay, he is our new supreme pontiff because God gave him. Now this is where they bastardized a little bit of the Bible. And they said, well, God put him in authority, so God must obviously want him to be in charge of the church. Oh, no. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that, but it does say that God allowed him to be put into authority. and that we should pray not only for kings and those in authority, but everybody else that we taught on a Sunday night in teens class, that we should pray not only for kings, but also we find principalities as well, and those that are magistrates, okay, meaning that power has been given to them, or they were picked and selected as a person to give power to. Okay, today we, like a judge, we elect a judge, but we don't elect police officers. Okay, we should pray for those people as well, because we elect the person that may pick them, or we elect them to an office hoping that they'll do it, but we should pray that they, adjudicate righteously, that they enforce the laws righteously, okay, that they do what it is that they're supposed to do. Because even then, power's been given to them. That means that God's appointed them for a position, or God has allowed them to have that position. But how many prayers throughout the year just had to be prayed before it was God's will for perfect religious freedom? Because they didn't have that in England. The king was the head of the church. Why do you think they were trying to get out of England? Because those that agreed with what the king's church believed, they'd either try and run people out of town if they didn't believe what the king said, because they would consider it treason. They would say, well, if you commit treason, that's guilty of death. For doing what? Believing what the Bible says. And then once they got to a new land where they hoped that they could have it, not all the time did they. In fact, one of those pictures, a Baptist preacher was in prison, and they had to put a man outside of his jail cell because he would preach through the jail bars, through the window, and it just naturally, kind of like how I didn't mean to, but it just kind of happened when I threw that handkerchief a second ago. Okay? He would just, preach with his arms through the bars of the jail cell, and they would put a guard outside to cut his hands so that he would keep his hands back inside. They thought that all the people that had come to hear him preach of his congregation, that they were going to, give him something to sneak out of the prison. So you see a picture of him with blood coming down on his hands. I'm convinced that he didn't really feel it because he kept doing it. It was just instinctive. But a man preaching from a jail cell to a congregation, why? Because he believed the Bible. Thankfully, those prayers have been answered. But we should continue to pray because it's not guaranteed. There are ways that you can amend a constitution. I've brainstormed on, ways that people could try and undermine religion. They tried to do it with separation of church and state, which isn't what separation of church and state means. That means that the state can't tell the church what to do because they don't want the king, like he was over in England, telling the church what it is that they needed to believe. That's separation of church and state. Nowhere in that clause does it say that the church can't tell the state what it is that the church would like. We can't order them to do it, but we certainly can give our opinion freely. Okay? So if anybody ever tells you that, say hogwash, and then say, oh, by the way, why do Catholic schools get to use public school buses? That always trips them up. But now look down in verse number 8. It says that, I will therefore, men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. Okay, then in verse number 9, speaking of women, it says, in like manner also the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broidered hair or gold or pearls or costly array, but which becometh women professing godliness with good works. Okay, this is where that openness, that outwardness that we talked about, on the Sunday before Thanksgiving, on our thanks, that's where this also comes in and other things as well. Now what's it say in verse number 8? That he would therefore, that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands. That's making it outward. You may not be praying audibly outward. There are a lot of times that people come to the altar and pray, and I can tell that they're praying something, but I can't make out the words. I'm not supposed to. I'm not really listening. I'm usually trying to keep up with the music. Okay, trying to remember the words of the song that I thought I knew at the beginning of the invitation, and now I'm realizing, well, maybe I don't know all the words like I thought I did. And I didn't hear what page he said in the songbook, so I can't find out. So I'm going to listen really close and hope that it comes back to me real quick. Okay, but sometimes you may not be able to make out what the person said, but you can tell if somebody's praying. He says lifting up holy hands, meaning being blameless before God. But if while you're praying, like they did it was the custom or was the practice in their day, that they would lift up their hands towards God, and usually with their face bowed down towards the ground. If you do that, people know you're praying. They don't have to hear you praying. They just look at you and say, that guy's praying. Not being ashamed of the fact that you can talk to God whenever it is you desire. He can talk to you whenever He desires to. Okay, that you're not trying to hide it. In fact, you're proud of it. Not proud that you're the one doing the prayer, but proud that the holy God of heaven does hear and answer prayer. So again, that outwardness, but what's it say? Without wrath and doubting. But what is wrath? That's the opposite of what we were commanded to pray for in the beginning. That we should be able to live peaceably among all men, in all godliness. What's wrath? Well, the Bible says be angry and sin not. Wrath is the manifestation of, or the acting upon, anger. If we do out of anger, we do out of the flesh. Now, what's the proper way to go about doing something when you're angry? Do what Jesus did. Go make a 3-quartered whip somewhere and calm down. And then, while you're doing it, pray to God, Lord, is this your will? If not, put the whip down and don't do it. But if it is, that's called righteous indignation. It's not called wrath, because you weren't angry anymore. You knew that it was the right thing to do, and you didn't do it out of anger. You did it out of love. Why did Jesus drive the money changers out? Because He loved them, and He didn't want them to do that no more. He also loved the house of God, and He didn't want that going on at the house of God. Oh, and by the way, it was commanded that they shouldn't do that. It went against the commandments of God. And He loved the law. Because the law said that, essentially, be ye holy for I am holy. We knew that we weren't holy. But Jesus loved the law enough to fulfill it because He loved us. And because He fulfilled it, every jot and tittle, that's why He was the perfect sacrifice made for the apostle. He gets into that in between the verses that we already read. That He was the perfect sacrifice for us. Okay, but all that, I'm not ashamed of any of that. Should be able to pray openly, but the moment that I commit an act in wrath, doesn't matter what I say, what matters is what I do. There are a lot of people throughout history, even before this, after this, even today, that claim to do righteously, but then we get a glimpse of them in wrath and we see, well, maybe they're not all that they say that they are. Maybe we're getting a peek behind the curtain of the great Wizard of Oz and we see it's just a dude behind a green curtain. Right? Maybe we're seeing through the facade that they put up, and now we're really seeing who they are. Where in the fruits of the Spirit, where in the works of God does it say to have wrath? Well, it doesn't. I do know that God's angry with the wicked every day. I do know that one day His judgment will come, but God doesn't do it out of anger. He does it out of holiness. He does it out of justice. He would have been justified in wiping man off of the face of the earth the moment that they sinned against God. But because of His mercy and His grace and His love and His long-suffering and His kindness and His gentleness and His meekness, He gave us the plan of salvation that He did. And those that reject it will have to suffer the judgment. It's not the wrath of God, although God can be wroth. Those are two different words. Okay, but if God doesn't do out of wrath, why should we? But then what's the next thing? He says, without doubting. Well, what's doubting? The exact opposite of faith. And we know that without faith, it's impossible to please Him. But truly, what is doubting? That's not believing that God can do what you're asking Him to do. That means that you're convinced that even though you're going to ask it of God, you're convinced God can't do it. Doubting means that when you're handing out a tract, within your heart, you're thinking, oh, this isn't going to help them. I know that this is the truth, but they're too far gone. But this is just a piece of paper. They got to hear preaching in order. Don't put constraints on God. Don't limit your faith based upon what you can understand. If I believed everything that I could, only believed what it is that I could understand about the Bible, it'd be a very short book. I don't understand how a great fish can be grown in the depths of the ocean, swallow a guy for 3 days and not digest him, and then puke him up on a beach. If he's that big, how's he getting that close to the shoreline? But the Bible says it happened. I believe it. Amen. To be honest with you, until I just said that, I'd never thought about any of those things in that story of Jonah. Why? Because that's not the important part of the story of Jonah. That was the penance that God had ordained for Jonah in order to get him to go to Nineveh. The story of Jonah is that there was a revival for a time in the wicked city of Nineveh, and everybody from the king down to everybody else got right with God. And then Jonah got upset about it. The story of Jonah is a story of doubting. Well, Lord, I don't think that you want me to go to Nineveh, so I'm going to go to Tarshish. Well, God, I'll go to Nineveh, but I don't think you can save anybody there. Whole city gets right with God. God, I'm angry because I didn't know that you could do that. And because I didn't believe it, I didn't think it was possible, and now I'm angry. Then eventually God's judgment does come to Nineveh, and he goes out and he sits down in the heat of the day, going to watch, probably with a little bit of, a smirk on his face, not realizing the entire time that, one, he's bald, and two, the sun's up overhead. He might get sun poisoning and die just watching the city be destroyed. God caused the gorge to go up over his head. Jonah had a lot of doubt, but in spite of it, God still used Jonah and did for Jonah when he didn't deserve it. But who does deserve the grace of God? Who in the city of Nineveh deserved to be redeemed, deserved to have Jonah come and teach or preach the truth of God to him? The answer is nobody. But there's a whole lot of doubt in that story. Thomas had a little bit of doubt to start, but then when he saw Jesus, he didn't need to actually put his finger into the nail print. He didn't need to thrust his hand into his... He saw him immediately, and he knew, that's him. All doubt was gone. Okay, I can kind of understand Thomas. I don't understand people that, but there's no reason. I've heard some of y'all say some crazy stuff. And I may, in passing, hear you say something and know that you said it, but until I can get some more information, I may not truly believe you. I may believe that you believe it, but I may not believe it. I can understand Thomas. I can understand how it happened, but as soon as, he didn't need to follow through with what he said. In other words, he was saying, until without a doubt I'm sure that it is, I'm not going to believe it. But when I got saved, all doubt was taken away. Amen. Faith won out over doubt, which is why I got saved. But if we keep doubting dead, we don't allow it to fester, that means that we're not doing in vain. If you don't really believe in what it is that you're doing, or believe that God wants you to do it, why are you doing it? If you don't believe that God can take your feeble efforts to do what it is that He wants to do, then why even waste your time? Because He's not going to. Because without faith, it's impossible to please Him. If you doubt, all the praying, all the lifting up of holy hands, all the 4 types of communication with God that we got in verse number 1, it's all for naught. So don't do it in wrath, but certainly don't do it in doubting. Okay, but then, to go further along with the outward manifestation, because again, the lifting up of holy hands, the men doing it in public, okay, this is making it known. Why go through all that effort if you don't believe it? But then in regards to the women, to summarize, because we're running out of time, he says not to be adorned with gold and with ornaments or pearls, right? Don't make a great show of what it is that God's given to you. He's saying a godly woman desires to be ordained with what? In verse number 10, with good works. Because it becomes those professing godliness. If we truly wish to live godly outwardly, there's got to be proof of it. Okay, if you truly want to live in godliness, which is what verse number 2 says, that we can have a peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. That was the desire of the Apostle Paul to pray. The Apostle Paul knew firsthand from his former life as Saul the strength of the conviction of those that didn't want our faith to continue and to thrive and survive. He knew how vehemently people hated the truth of God when they were in outer dark, when they were walking around in blindness and sin. He knew that they knew the lengths that they would go to keep it from spreading. And because he knew that, his desire was that men everywhere would lift up holy hands, praying and asking God that they would be able to live peaceably among men in all godliness and honesty. That's the goal. That we would have the freedom to live godly and do it not in secret, right? Because there were times in the church that it had to go underground, that they were persecuted to the point that they couldn't meet openly and in public. Okay, to do it, it's openly. Invite anybody to come and hear what we have to say, because we're not afraid that if they hear, they'll go and tell somebody, and then the law might come. Right? Or an angry group of, villagers with pitchforks and torches and probably a couple of weapons in the mix would come and kick down the door and set fire to the church. They may not be able to legally prosecute us, okay, but they may come and, try and burn down the church. They may come and try to, beat the preacher up and discourage him from doing it. That we don't have to worry about it. We can do it peaceably in all godliness and honesty. So if that's the goal, verse number 10 tells us what becomes godliness. What's that? Being adorned with good works. It's one thing to say. It's another thing that it's so valuable to you that that's what you want people to see. Why do people wear jewelry? Because it has value to them. Little known fact. Most of the time you can't see it because I'm wearing a tie. But I do have a necklace on. And it's not 24 karat because they can't make jewelry out of that because it's too soft and it'll break or it'll bend and it'll warp. I don't know what it is. But my grandfather gave it to me. And it's the scales of justice on a pendant. It's on a chain. I don't wear that for you to see it. That's why it's under the shirt. I wear it because it has value to me. In this day and age, you showed your position in society by what you adorned yourself with. Anybody remember the way that they did it mockingly, and they did it wrong, but they did give a purple robe to Christ, mocking him, claiming, well, you're our deity, because purple was a representation of the fact that you had money back then. Because in order to get the dye to make something purple, it was a very lengthy process, it was a very tedious process, and you had to get it from a worm, and they would crush up a whole bunch of them, I think it might have been silkworms, which again, they're very valuable because those make silk. You don't kill those for anything. Silk was also made a whole lot of money. But you take some of them and you grind them up, and it was their blood that made the garment purple. That was the dye. Very costly. Only the rich could afford purple. So if you wore purple, outwardly you were saying, I got more money than you. Okay, the women of this day, jewelry may not have been as gaudy as it is today. Okay? When you got sunglasses that are bigger than your head and the person's head next to you hanging off your face, that might be a little much. Okay? I believe that the first person to do that was Elton John, by the way, not a woman. But he does, act like one. Anyway, different topic for a different day. Point is, it was a status symbol. It may have been very small in comparison to some of the things that people wear today. Okay, certainly they didn't have watches back then, and if they did, they wouldn't have one as big as this. I promise you that. How do you know that? Because this sucker's heavy. I've gotten used to it over the years, but anybody that ever has to see it, when I take it off and give it to them, man, this is heavy. This is one of the lighter ones that I've got. I got this one so that it would fit underneath of my shirt sleeves when I'm wearing a suit, because some of the other ones are too tall to do that. Okay, they didn't do it for size. It was a status symbol of, I can afford to do it. It may have been a very small bracelet, but very few people back then had gold bracelets. It may have been a small token around the necklace. It may have been a very simple necklace made out of thread, but the pendant may have been what was valuable about it. Okay, they wore it to show outwardly what it is that they wore. It didn't mean something to them. It meant something to somebody else. I wear it to show other people who I am. And oh, by the way, the world today, still by the way that you dress, by the way that you act, by the way that you do, they could tell who it is that you really are. Just like people in church, you may have me fooled. That's not the goal. The goal is that you can stand before a just and holy and righteous God, and He say to you, well done, thou good and faithful servant. It's not having the wool pulled over my eyes. It's not interchanging masks so that you can put on the face of whoever it is that you're hanging around with. The Apostle Paul said whether we went to the Gentile, whether we went to the Hebrew, whoever it was, we were just us. By the grace of God, He made us what we were, and He's turned us into what we are now after we got saved. I'm just going to be that because that's what God chose for me to be. I got a hard enough time remembering myself what it is I'm supposed to do, who I am. On some days, you know, why I'm even doing what it is that I'm doing. I don't have time to worry about multiple personality disorder, coming up with different routines to put on in front of other people. Okay? Double-minded man's unstable in all his ways, the Bible says. If you want to be two different people instead of the one that God made you, I'd do some checking up. Your life might be built on shifting sands instead of that solid rock. Not my opinion, that's the Bible. So what's the goal? Not to be ordained with things that mean something to other people. Be ordained with what it is that is important to you because it's important to the one that saved you. When people look at us, Matthew chapter number 5, they should see our good deeds and glorify our Father which is in heaven. What becometh someone professing godliness? Being ordained with godly works. James wrote, I will prove to you my faith by my works. It's one thing to claim it. Well, yeah, I believe that. It's another thing to say, this is what I believe, and here's how you can know that I really believe it. James wasn't saying, I'll prove salvation to you by what I'm doing. He's saying, I'll prove to you that I really do believe it. Because everything that I do is based on the fact that I'm doing it because I do believe. His challenge to the other people was, you go and do your works and prove to me that those works will actually attain salvation. He's saying, go and write the check, take it to your bank, and prove to me that the check won't bounce. That's what he was saying. But what he was saying to them is, I know that what I've gotten's good, and not because I'm going to go out and try and earn it. I know I've got it, so I'm going to live like it. I'm going to try and give it to other people. Those that buy into works are only concerned about themselves because they're trying to do all that they can do. He's saying, I'm good. So I'm going to try and be what He wants me to be, and I'm going to try and live a way that others will see what I have, glorify God, and want to have it too. How did He do that? By being ordained with godliness. By being ordained with godly works. And most of the time, they did it at a time where they didn't live peaceably among all men. Most of the time, they did it when kings and when those in authority wanted to have them killed. You do realize that the one that put Paul to death was Nero, Caesar. He ruled the entire empire. You do realize that the ones that wanted to kill Paul before he got to Nero, because he didn't go before Nero first, he went before a different Caesar. And then Nero came into power, and then he didn't like Christians, and he tried to blame them for a fire that started in Rome so that everybody would get off of his back because he really did start it. Okay? But the point is, long before Paul ever got to Rome, who wanted to kill him? The rulers of the Jews. In fact, you go and read the book of Acts, everybody that he goes before, from Felix to Festus to Agrippa, all the people that he saw before he saw Caesar, before he got to Rome, all of them from the outside in said, this guy hadn't done anything wrong. Certainly nothing that's worthy of death. And these men weren't just, run-of-the-mill Joes that were, well, I'm going to believe them. They knew the law because they were, of a position of that region. It was part of their job to know the customs of the Jews and the laws of the Jews, because they were the ones set up by Caesar to rule over them. They had to know how they lived in order to do it in a way that wasn't going to cause a riot every day. So they knew in fact, Paul said, I'm happy to testify before Agrippa because I know that Agrippa knows all this stuff. He says he understands it. Those that understood said he didn't do anything wrong, but he had already appealed to Caesar, so he had to go to Rome. But the Jews didn't care about the law. What did they care about? Killing Paul. In fact, before Agrippa, before Festus, before Felix, Paul was with a centurion outside of Caesarea, close by. And there were men that were going to petition the centurion to have Paul come out and give answer to the charges, because that was the custom under Roman. That's where we get that we have a right to face our accusers. That was actually something instituted by Rome. By the way, another constitutional right. But they petitioned for Paul, and there were men lying in wait that had taken a vow, I'm not going to eat, drink, or do anything except look for Paul until Paul's dead. So we're not going to eat or drink until he's dead, till we kill him. But then Paul's nephew, his sister's son, comes and tells the centurion that the centurion got Paul out of Dodge really quick in the night, sent a whole bunch of troops with him. Said, hey, take him down there over to Caesarea, get him in the big guy's house, and keep him there, keep him safe. Then they came angry, petitioning the governor, saying, well, that centurion that's protecting this Roman citizen that we don't have a right to, he stuck him out during the middle of the night and we wanted to see him dead. Well, what's he done? He disagrees with us. On what? The resurrection. That there is life after death. Because the Pharisees believed that, the Sadducees didn't. They didn't even agree on it, but they wanted to kill Paul for not agreeing on it. God's not the author of confusion. Say all that to say this. Why'd they have a problem with Paul? The real problem wasn't the fact that they didn't agree with him. They got along with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They got along with each other. They didn't agree. Sadducees didn't believe that there was a resurrection after death. The Pharisees did. But yet they still ruled side by side as the rulers of the Jews. Well, Paul was actually a Pharisee, before he got saved. He did believe in the resurrection. In fact, he used that at one point. I really like that about Paul. He went lawyer on them. They were having a trial on whether or not to kill him. And he says, I know that you guys are Pharisees. Well, then he saw that the Sadducees were there as well. And he said, my past life, I was a Pharisee. I believe in the rest. And they started arguing between themselves. They forgot all about Paul. In fact, the centurion went down and said, well, they're literally going to try and pull him apart, because one of them saying, well, he believes in us. The other one's saying, well, that's not right. So he went down and he got him and brought him into the fortress, keep him safe. He went tactical on him. But what was their real problem? Not that he didn't agree, that he was adorned with godly works. That he truly sought to live peace. He didn't have a problem with them. In fact, he wanted to give them something, not take something from them. What was that? The truth of God. In fact, why do most people believe that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews? Because so often he talked about his heart's desire, his intercession and his supplication on behalf of the fact of the people of Israel, God's chosen people, rejecting God's chosen one, his son. It was his heart's desire for Israel that they be saved. And it's written a whole lot like the Apostle Paul wrote. But I believe that he had a burden so strong. He didn't want them to know that it was from him, because he knew that if they knew it was from him, they'd fight about the fact that Paul wrote it. The one that used to be Saul. He didn't put his name on it to remove any controversy from it. He said, I don't want credit. I want God to get the credit for it. He said, I don't want you to see who wrote it in the flesh. I want you to see the Spirit that penned it. And I want you to see the truth of the law to understand grace. He says, one more time before I die, Lord, give me an opportunity to write him a letter. I can see him say it. Why did God allow the book of Hebrews by whomever to be written? Because God wanted a whole book one more time. Even though that he came into his own and his own received him not, one more time he wrote a whole book to him, a whole epistle to the Hebrews, explaining just one more time. From the prophets, from even before that, to just the men that lived like Job, who just lived righteously, just believed God because it had been handed down since the garden. Long before that with Noah. Okay, all of that. Up until the point that Jesus died. One more time to tell him, I told you what was wrong because I loved you. You can find that in the chapter before this. That the righteous have no need of the law. The law is given for the thieves, for the murderers, for the unrighteous. To show them that what they're doing is wrong. That's why the law was written. The law's not for the righteous, but the law was to show us that we needed somebody righteous to save us, to redeem us. What is being adorned with godliness really all about? Showing the world that what you've got is not good enough. And what I've got now, I didn't get. It was given to me. To be ordained with it, or to be adorned with it, to show that you've been ordained by God. Chosen. And they've been chosen too. But in order to receive, they have to get in.